I wanted to ask something about Jean-Luc Godard here.
Yeah,
I
sure.
wanted to read this quote. I thought was really interesting. He said here to you, he said, a lot of people, when they go from New York to Honolulu, don't think that between New York and Honolulu, they still exist, even if it's a 10-hour flight. To me, what exists is mainly between. And I try to put this between in my films. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think he meant literally what he said. He, I think he wanted to talk about a certain type of continuity. That so much of our cultural life is based on alienation, which is sometimes alienation of ourselves from the public, alienation from ourselves, and so on. And one example of that is that idea that you almost feel like we don't exist when we're traveling somewhere, that we only exist at the where we get on the plane and where we get off, or the same, or with the same with the train or bus or and so on. Um, so I think it's partly about that. It's partly basically trying to say um, that the in between that we don't pay attention to is sometimes the main thing we should be paying attention to.
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. And I know when you interviewed him the first time, it was when he released Every Man for Himself. What did you think of
Yeah,
that film? I just watched it recently. I was really impressed by it. I mean, it's brutal in a lot of ways. It's
yeah, it's
portrayal of
very
a
brutal, and maybe because of its brutality, it's not one of my favorites of his
right.
films. Um, I actually feel but it had represented an important step because it was him sort of coming back to attempting to do narrative films,
Right.
which was always a little difficult for him after doing, sort of like essays. But to me, much more major late, film of his would be, well, if it's a film and rather than a video, is Histoire de Cinema. And I
Yes,
think
right.
some of his last features I like more than I like Every Man for Himself.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
Which is, even the title bothers me a little bit. It should be, "So qui pour la vie." It means, it can also be translated as "run for your life." I mean, actually, it's like that. Uh,
well, Godard, he's always someone I've been conflicted about because I sort of felt that once he got to the 70s, I remember when I was much young, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I would anything post 1970, I would stop it within 10 minutes because I just thought, what happened to this guy? But I'm sort of coming around to him. I don't know. Would you say they're like filmed essays? A lot of things he did post 70s. I mean, is that kind of a way to put them?
yes, well, it's partly that, but I think I also have to say that the stuff in it, the so-called Ziegler Vertov films, I've never liked. I mean, I think when he starts to become interesting again, even though he becomes more difficult, his later films,
Right.
is with Numero Deux, not with things like Wind from the East and so on.
Right.
And even Numero Deux is kind of difficult, but I actually think that I think one of the things that he lost as a filmmaker is when he moved from Paris to Rolle, which is close to where he grew up, this little village in Switzerland, which I've never been to, but it seems to me like he cut himself off from kind of a social exchange with other people and colleagues to a
Mm,
certain extent, and that he became a little bit like a kind of hermit
mm,
afterwards.
right.
I mean, and when he would go to festivals, at least when I saw him, he made genuine attempts to kind of communicate, but it was harder for him to communicate because he was more isolated.
Right.
And so I think that that's what kind of like leads to some of those difficulties. But I can only say that the late works repay, giving more attention to them because I think they really have a lot going on in them. It's just that they don't have the kind of user-friendly aspects of his 60s work.
Right. Right. What was your impression of him as just as a man getting to know him? Was he was he fun to be around? Did you enjoy being in his company? I mean, He
Well,
even in
to
interviews, he's
some
very,
extent, he
yeah,
was unpredictable.
right.
I mean, one of the things that I remember is that I'd be having a conversation with somebody else who knew him, and a very talented American independent filmmaker named Rob Tregenza, who also teaches. And in fact, one of his features was actually produced by Godard, but most people don't know this because Godard was could be a very generous person. He was very generous to me, but at the same time, he didn't like to advertise the fact that he was being generous. It was more like a kind of secretive generosity. In any case, I was having a conversation with Rob, and Godard was sitting there. This was in Toronto. And he seemed like Godard was on the moon, like he wasn't paying any attention to what we were saying. But a whole day later, I was sitting with Godard somewhere, and he turned to me and he started talking about my conversation with Rob. And he obviously was following all of it, but he didn't want, there were times in which I think he kind of like, sometimes he enjoyed being the sort of guru that people would ask questions from, but
Right.
sometimes he didn't like doing that. And so I think he kind of like was picky about when, so like I think sometimes he wanted to excuse himself from, playing a kind of social role. So he would do things to kind of set himself off or even to alienate people. I can remember one meeting he was having with a CD company CEO, in which he was pouring ketchup into a glass of water and then stirring it and then drinking it. And it was kind of like, it was not the, and nobody referred to it while he was doing it, but it was almost like a kind of way of saying, keep your distance, people.
Oh my
It's like,
God, that's quite something. I mean, it's probably very difficult for anyone to answer, but do you have any opinion as to why he withdrew himself so much? Why he became such a hermit? Like, I don't know if you would happen to have any idea.
well, it had a lot to do, I don't know. Some of it had to do with Anne-Marie Mayville, who actually, I even think that she had a lot to do with his decision to commit suicide because he was afraid of, he didn't want to be a burden to her.
Right.
Uh, and the fact that, in other words, he wanted to live close to her, and she was Swiss, and they lived a few, I mean, I don't know if it was a few blocks apart, but not far from each other. But I think it might have partly had to do with that. Interestingly enough, another filmmaker wound up in the same village, Straub, and he had a partner who was Swiss.
Mm.
So I don't know. It might have had to do partly with that, partly going back to his roots because he grew up there in that area of Switzerland.
Mm.
And he liked to use a lot of those locations in his films. And, I think he made some of his best and some of his worst works there. Like I think I would call King Lear one of his best, and Forever Mozart one of his worst. But they were both made in that neck of the woods.
Right. You said you wrote something that I thought was really interesting about how he uses homage as critical transformation as opposed to
Yes.
Tarantino or Scorsese, where it's quite, the homage is quite obvious what they're getting at. I mean, can you elaborate on what you mean by critical transformation?
It's funny because I would include Schrader too, because the funny thing about
Yeah.
Schrader is he's constantly referencing Pickpocket, but he's only referencing the story and the dialogue of Pickpocket. He's never referencing the style or the form of Pickpocket, which is quite radical.
Right.
So there's a certain kind of way in which, is why Bresson was not a commercial filmmaker largely, in terms of. So I think that the idea is Godard also admitted to me that even though he was being a critic when he made films, it often wasn't conscious, that it was something like that he was just sort of instinctively, because his view of certain filmmakers and films was different from other people's. But you see, what sort of always annoys me in the homages of Bogdanovich and Scorsese and Schrader and so on, is that they have the same image of these films that everybody else does. It's almost like they get converted into rubber, like stamps.
Right.
Like if you could reduce a movie to a postage stamp,
Mm-hmm.
like the Odessa steps in Potemkin, or the shower scene and like that kind of thing,
Right.
and it's like, and all. So what does it do when they do an homage? It's almost like ownership. This is mine. This is
Right.
I like, but it doesn't say why they like it or what makes their liking of it different from other people's liking, which is what Godard's references always do. And again, it might not have been deliberate. It
Right.
was just nature of the fact that Godard saw these things differently.
Right. Right. Yeah, because like you had mentioned Alphaville as one, and I rewatched it, and it's you could see the influence of German expressionism or Fritz Lang, but it doesn't at the same time. It just feels totally Godard. Like it just feels like if there was any homage, like he had told you, he was not aware of it. It was just something in his subconscious.
Yeah, he discovered later. I
Right.
mean, he admitted. And so in the later episodes of Histoire de Cinema, he actually acknowledges the links of his own work to, for example, he shows clips from Alphaville in juxtaposition with clips from Fritz Lang's Destiny, one of his silent films, also known, it's known by different titles, but Destiny is probably the best known English title for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's sort of him discovering later that's what he was doing, but he
Right.
wasn't aware of it at the time. He made Alphaville.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. You can also leave a donation directly to my YouTube channel by pressing the thanks link, which you will find just below the video frame, right beside the like and dislike links. Just click the thanks link, and from there, you can leave a donation if you choose to. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the Movies logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left. In just a second, just click on that. And then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes. Thank you so much, everyone. I will see you in the next episode.